So many years ago, there was a guy whose name was Plato, an actual man who lived some 2,500 years ago, who had a teacher named Socrates, who himself had a teacher named Diotima. Plato came up with a story. It's an interesting story. Most often it's kind of just spoken or expressed very briefly, casually. It's called Allegory of the Cave, and it covers, I suppose, a lot of bases. Almost all the questions that we've encountered in this class are embodied in that particular story. So there is this guy that is born in this cave. One of the things about cave is that it's dark and you're born in it, which means that it's the only world that you know. And it's not really a physical cave, it's an intellectual, psychological, emotional cave. And consider the cave to be like 4 or 5 chains that all of us in this class have, and they wrap themselves around our bodies, our psyches, our intellects. There is a German philosopher named Martin Heidegger. He has this concept, it's called thrownness, that we are thrown into this world. Nobody asks our permission. It's something that Omar Khayyam had mentioned, that you come out of your mom, you're either a man or a woman. I'm not talking about 2023 where you can be all sorts of things. And if you come out as a woman, there are certain things that your body will demand of you. And after a while, there are certain things that your psyche will demand of you. And you have really no choice about any of those things. You can come out as an introvert or an extrovert, and you have no control over any of that either. And you come out as white, as brown, as yellow, as black, as red, and you have no choice to correct any of that stuff. It just comes with you. You come into a society over which you have zero power, and that society will judge you for your skin color, that society will judge you for your gender. All of us are condemned. You don't choose your parents. You can come out of your mother's womb and your father's an alcoholic, and there's nothing you can do. And while you were in your mom, she could have been a drug addict, and there isn't much you can do about that either. You're not born in the 15th century, you're not born in the 16th century, you're not in an Amish community. You're born in Oakland in 2023. The moment you open your eyes, you're either living in a studio with 2 parents, 5 siblings, or you're born in a mansion. You're either in a place of privilege or a place of poverty. And wherever you are born, and remember, every culture has its own set of advertisements. If you live in Roseville, where my parents live and where I used to live for 30 years, and it happens to be a very religious environment to some extent, there are churches everywhere. There's a good chance that you're going to go to church every Saturday and every Sunday and every Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday. Which means that if one asks you any questions, you're going to respond to those questions according to the advertisements that live inside your head, which is religion. If on the other hand, you have parents who care very little about religion and like music, like Beyonce and Kanye West and Miley Cyrus, well, that's where you're happy, that's where your identity lives. So we're all condemned. And that is the cave. And the cave, every cave has a wall. And on every cave wall, come and go shadows. You leave your house and a nice looking man walks your way and you say, wow, I like this particular face. I like this shadow. You go home, you're driving home and you turn on the radio and there is Miley Cyrus singing and it tantalizes your interior. And you realize what Plato perhaps may be suggesting about the cave is that it's something that holds all of us hostage. Our culture, our history, personal, cultural, the world of advertisement, our parents, our addictions to things, our parents' addictions to things, our temperaments, and none of us are free. Which means that we're going to, in our consciousness or this container that lives inside us, it's going to be filled with biases, prejudices, judgments of all sorts, and we don't really understand them. But we have them nevertheless because they are our GPS to who we are and what we are and how we should live our lives and how other people should function. And just in case someone asks you a question that's going to rock the very foundation of your belief system, it's going to make you unhappy. It's going to make you doubt. It's going to create fear inside you. And you will do whatever you can to keep whatever has been given to you in this cave alive. It makes you happy. And one of the things you need to understand about this cave is that since every single one of us in this class live in our own private caves, there are shadows on this wall that we like. There are shadows on this wall that we have faith in. There are shadows on this wall that guide us, tell us who we are. They define happiness for us. They define what the meaning of life is for us. And we don't like people challenging them. We don't like people pushing us to a point where we begin to doubt the things in which we believe. It is true, all of us come to class, we ask questions. But the nice things about our questions is that they're not very serious. And you should be very thankful that they're not serious. And even if they are very serious, you should be very thankful that you don't live in a physical space that supports and encourages asking those questions more often, because then your life would fall apart. So yes, as curious animals, we have no choice but to ask questions. It makes for a great classroom environment, but that's where it just ends. It's just a conversation. Now, just in case you're curious as to how the shadows are created, there is a fire in the background somewhere. You can consider that to be advertisements of sorts that creates reflection, that creates imagination, that creates desires, that creates ambitions, that creates psychological narratives, whatever they may be. It doesn't really matter. You come to this class for 3 units for a letter grade so you can graduate and have a happy life. Better life at least. Well, that's a piece of advertisement. That's a shadow to which you and I cling on. Now, 2 things happen to this young kid. Now, the first thing that you need to understand is it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter what you are. You live in a cave, and despite once in a while throwing a temper tantrum, you enjoy being in the cave. It gives you certitude. It tells you who you are. Your doubts, your fears are not as intense. They don't paralyze you physically or psychologically, emotionally. Life goes on. Something awful happens to one of the occupants or one of us in this class. Now remember, just because you live in this cave, it doesn't mean you accept everything. There are things you reject, you just don't reject intensely. There are things you doubt, the doubts are not as intense. There are things you fear, but they don't lead to paralysis. One of us in this class has a very, very, very tragic experience. You could either be walking to Safeway and you run into this fellow and you don't know why, you don't know how, but you look at him and for some strange reason, it's instantaneous. He makes you feel empty and you don't know why. He has this power over you. Carlos Castaneda, a PhD student in UCLA doing his doctorate program in anthropology, he was interested in drugs and how they influence the human psyche and their powers over the human psyche. And he's told that if he goes to Arizona, he can find some Yaqui Indians, Mexicans, who know a thing or two about these drugs. And so one day they're just standing and his friend looks at him and says, Carlos, that old man over there, he knows a thing or two about drugs. So if you want to kind of figure things out, go talk to him. Castaneda says there was something about his eyes. They had this like pool of gold in them. And there was just something about his presence that made me nervous, that made me tremble on the inside. And I began to just ramble on and on and on and on. And I pretended to know things. And I pretended that, in fact, he needs to come to me to learn about drugs, about peyote, not the other way around. And after 3 hours, the bus comes. The old man looks at him and says, thank you, it's good to meet you, gets on the bus and leaves. And Castaneda just stands there, says, what the hell happened? I rambled on for 3 hours, just talking about nonsense. Why? Now, sometimes you encounter people like that, where they leave this mark inside you. They're like tulip in the sense that at the very center of the red tulip, there's this black mark. That once in a while, we have these experiences that just burn inside us. They leave this lasting impression, and that's exactly what happened to Carlos. He goes back to Los Angeles, but he can't get rid of the memory of this man, this experience. So he goes back to look for him and eventually finds him. And this old man looks at him and says, what took you so long? Now, what you need to understand about Carlos Castaneda is that you're a PhD candidate, you think you know it all, you think you have a great amount of power. There is this old man, he's uneducated, never gone to school, never read a book, and yet he has this power over you. So remember this fellow in the cave who has lived with the shadows and loved the shadows for 5 years, for 10 years, for 20 years, for 50 years, all of a sudden runs into someone that creates this intense doubt about him. And he wants to run away, but he can't. And though you have a PhD in the presence of this 60-year-old man, you feel as if you are a novice. Now, it may be that this kid who's now beginning to ask difficult questions is going to continuously ask difficult questions, but that's not the case. There comes a point where Carlos Castaneda looks at this old man, and it's only after a year. The demands are just way too much. The cross that Carlos has to carry because of the wisdom of this old man, because of the presence of this old man, it's just way, way, way too much. And after a year, he says, I can't do this anymore. My life is falling apart. I'm losing interest in my own education. I'm losing interest in my own people, in my own life, in my own self. I can't do this anymore. He walks away. But the first thing that you need to understand is sometimes when we ask questions very, very intensely, and it's not just out of curiosity, there is this thing about it that just needs to know that you have this intimacy with the question that you're asking. And you know what happens in intimacy? You have this deep need to be around, to lay next to this person. Now, the frightening part to this is you have believed in the shadows you've been worshiping for about 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And now you begin to doubt yourself, and you begin to doubt your intellect, and you begin to doubt your happiness. You begin to doubt your decision-making abilities. Now, how long do you think you can live with that doubt in such an intense, intimate way before you completely shatter into 1,001 pieces? Remember, we are pleasure-seeking animals. Reflection goes against the flow of life. Life desires to make all of us into machines. Reflection pushes us into this desire to be free, to understand, to unravel. So one way that you can find yourself in intense intimacy with asking difficult philosophical questions is by running into a very strange person who immediately forces you to ask questions, begin to self-reflect and introspect. Now remember, one of the things about worshiping shadows, any shadow, you can worship Jesus Christ, you can worship the Quran, but those are things on the outside that you can look, you can see, you can touch, you can smell. But when you begin to doubt, it means you want to process things from your inside. And it's a place that human beings rarely visit because it is dark and it doesn't have any shadows because there is no light. And when you go within, where it's dark, with no light, you're going to be angry, you're going to be frightened, you're going to be lonely, and you're going to be depressed. And you better hope that this journey towards your interior happens only once or twice every year. Because if you're doing this every single day, you're eventually going to be unreachable to your people. And not only do you have to deal with the fact that you're becoming slowly a jerk to other people, but why, as a 40, 50, 60-year-old man or woman, you're so confused when in fact you should get everything together. But at that time, in your age, 50, you should get it together. You should know a thing or two about life. There is another way that you can have a meaningful world of doubt and skepticism. It's you're in high school, you have a boyfriend or you have a girlfriend, and you love him, and you do all sorts of things with him. And you don't really even need to love anyone. The fact you just hang around the same body day after day after day, that itself will produce some affection and love and intimacy and addiction to someone's body, someone's face, someone's intellect, someone's smell, emotions, all that. And so you're 19 now, you're both in love, you both graduated, you both have a decent job that makes a decent amount of money, you get married. But you can't stay 20 for too long, and you can't walk away from the responsibilities or complexities of life for too long. Life will eventually catch you. And eventually your life becomes a bit more complicated. And then one day you just wake up like 2 in the morning, you turn to your left, and there is your high school sweetheart to whom you're married and have 25 kids with. And then you ask a question that you never asked before. Why am I here? Now the question is frightening because it's the first time you're asking this question and you have no idea what to do with it. You begin to self-inflict that, am I betraying him or her? Am I being an idiot? Am I being a this? Am I being a that? And you ask advice. Maybe you even go to therapy without your companion knowing, because you want to make sure that this sorts of questions with this sort of intensity never appears, because you don't want to break up your relationship. You don't want to disappoint your kids. You don't want to disappoint your parents. You don't want to disappoint God. And all of a sudden you realize the moment you ask these questions, your version of happiness has begun to change. You don't know why, but life itself has seasoned you a little, has pushed you into this place where you begin to ask difficult questions. You don't need a teacher for that. You don't need someone like Don Juan. You don't need a Socrates. You don't need a John the Baptist. You don't need a Jesus Christ or a Mahatma Gandhi or a Malcolm X. Life does that to you. The only problem with life breaking you is that life has only one function: to break you. It's not going to provide answers. You need to have the tools to kind of process why you're broken, how you're broken, and how you can put yourself back together. A teacher, on the other hand, a teacher would deliberately guidedly break you, support you in your brokenness and depression, and then in time will put you back together. So remember, this kid in the Plato's Allegory of the Cave, he loves what he sees, he loves his life, and all the personal, historical, cultural advertisement that lives inside him. Those are the shadows. At a certain point, he becomes unhappy. Remember again, unhappy because of age and what life delivers, or unhappy because a teacher walks into his or her life. Now, if you all of a sudden begin to ask difficult questions at the age of 20, and you're very intimate with those difficult questions, you don't really have very many things to lose. You don't have a wife, hopefully, at the age of 20. You don't have kids at the age of 20. All you have is a crummy car that's about 50 years old. And you have the stamina, the energy, the vitality to just put some things in your backpack and go to the forest. And the only thing you care about is, I hope my mom will be okay and I hope my father will understand. So there are only two people that you'll feel guilty for abandoning, your mom and your dad. If on the other hand, you start asking questions very much like the kid in the Allegory of the Cave, at the age of 40, well, the way things usually work out by the time you're 40 is that you have a job. You've signed a lease to a house or an apartment. It's either a 30-year mortgage or a 2 or 3 year lease. You probably have a companion. You probably have children. You're attached to your sofas. You're attached to your car. You're attached to Oakland, the physical location in which you live. And now when you begin to ask questions, the problem with the intensity of asking, are the shadows, are the things that live inside me, are the things that have made me happy all these years, are they going to continue to make me happy? Because I don't feel like they are. Now you realize your wife, your kids, your parents, your job, your house, everything is at risk. Remember, at the age of 20, if you do this, you only have 2 or 3 people and things you have a guilt trip over. When you're a bit older and you've accumulated things of life, it's going to be very, very difficult for you to walk away. So the guilt you have at the age of 20 is 10% intensity. The guilt you have at the age of 40 for leaving things behind, it's going to devour you. It's going to kill you from the inside. A 20-year-old will get sad and depressed. The depression of a 40-year-old is paralysis. And it's going to take some time for you to recover. So when you read Allegory of the Cave, don't just read it as a story. Internalize it. As someone who is born, given all these pieces of advertisements, and the promises is that if you follow the dictums of society, you will get to the promised land. So you get your PhD, you're still miserable. You get married, you're still miserable. Not miserable that your wife makes you miserable, that there is some pieces missing in the grand puzzle that lives inside you, looking for ways to figure out, what is it I'm missing? They told me to get married, I am married. They told me to have kids, I have kids. They told me to go to school, get a job, buy a house, I have all of this, and yet there is something missing and I know not what. For the first time in his life, the sense of doubting what has been given to this kid, it comes forth full force. And he looks to his left, looks to his right, he looks behind him, and he says, I am driving to AT&T shop, not because my phone is bad, not because it's broke, but because I've been duped by this piece of advertisement. And I'm held hostage by this idea that if I live in society, I'll be more accomplished, more proficient, more happy. And the moment I begin to doubt all the stuff, I have to pick up my wife, my kids, go buy a boat and live in the middle of the ocean. Not see my parents, not see my siblings, lose my job, and God knows what's going to happen to my wife or my kids. So it's best not to ask, and it's best not to see, and it's best not to be aware. But Plato doesn't say any of those things, because the Allegory of the Cave is not an inspiring story. It's one tragedy after another. And it's not something that should be encouraged, but discouraged. Because no one is going to break away from the shadows if you're just mildly curious. And when you're mildly curious, you can have balance. You can love both Satan and God. If on the other hand, you want to know why there are these chains wrapped around your psyche, the only way you will be free is by being an extremist. And for the first time, this kid comes to realize the shadows on the wall really is created by 2 things: fire and people moving back and forth carrying objects. If I ask you, What's happening with Israel and Palestine? Some of you have watched CNN. That gives you a good set of shadows. Some of you have watched Fox, another set of shadows. Some of us are moved by our own pathetic infantile emotions of justice and vengeance and righteousness. That's another set of shadows. Now that he knows that all the shadows on the wall, all the desires that live inside you and I, all the emotions that live inside you and I, are created by other things, other people, other forces. If you've been to therapy for the past 20 years because of your father, it is your father who has created those emotions inside you. And you go to therapy for 20 years and you speak about the shadows that he has built inside you for 20 years. And one of the things, of course, therapy does is free you from that enslavement, hopefully. But the shadows on the wall in Allegory of the Cave, written by Plato, is not about this incident or this experience or that experience. He's talking about the entirety of human existence is nothing but shadows. That our emotions don't belong to us. They're not our creation, and neither are our philosophies of life. As you begin to understand the reason for the existence of shadows, something really interesting happens. The psychological change, the emotional change, the intellectual change, spiritual change, all the things you used to believe in and you would fight for, and give your life for, you realize they're loosening a little. They're no longer holding you down. You can actually walk freely. The problem now is, okay, where do you go now? You no longer believe in the shadows. You no longer believe in happiness. For the first time, you've come to realize your father has no power over you. And now you knock on the door and you say, hey, Dad, after 20 years. But it's a brand new experience. No shadows mean that you will never allow anyone to create any emotions inside you. Do you know what it means not to be impacted by the stories created by other people? That you become indifferent to their pains. You become indifferent to their sorrows, to their joys, because you know that these are only shadows that inspire them for a minute or two, then they will disappear. If you have found the very foundation of marriage, for example, that it's not a thing that will bring you happiness, just in case you have a moment where your woman or your man inspires you, you know it's just accidental inspiration that soon will be replaced by the realities of life. And that's one of the problems with life. It doesn't allow shadows to stay on the wall for too long. And you should just be very, very lucky if one shadow can be replaced with another very quickly, so you don't have time to examine and to reflect. Now, I don't have the language to express or describe the anguish that lives inside this young man who for the first time has come to realize that everything he has believed in his entire life has been false. Eventually he stands up, and in Arabic it's called qiyam. You revolt. You revolt against the lies that have been given to you, and you revolt against the lies that have lived inside you. And you are disgusted by your own self for having believed in all the lies, all the shadows that you have created, others have created. And then you pass by the people who are walking back and forth, and you pass by the fire, because you know these two are the culprits. They are the ones who created the illusions. They are the cause of samsara, or this ocean of suffering. Now that you have passed, you're no longer looking at the wall. Now that you're no longer looking at people behind you or the fire behind those people, you look ahead, but you don't see anything. You can no longer trust anything. You need to understand how difficult it is for this kid in the cave to come to a place where they no longer depend or can trust or have faith in their own decision-making, in their own eyes. You know, when the earthquake in San Francisco happened, if you were in the Bay Area, there are moments where you couldn't trust the ground on which you were walking because it could open at any time and swallow you. So you walk cautiously. Perhaps every moment you had this idea that the earth is going to swallow you, going to disappear forever. And you better say your goodbyes right now. You no longer have shadows on the outside. You no longer have shadows on the inside. And if you don't have narratives or stories on your inside, consider yourself to be completely depressed and hopeless. You're not yet seasoned in nothingness. You're not a Lao Tzu just yet. You're not a Jesus Christ just yet. You're really a nobody. You're a nothing. And that's devastating. I'm not even talking about you looking at your companions, realizing they believe in something. You believe in zero. You want to be like them, but you can't. You know too much now. That your companion looks at you and says, I love you, but you see too much and you know too much and you feel too much. And like a good politician, you look at him or her and say, I love you too, even though you know it's crumbling. This is a devastating place to be for any human being at any stage. There is a scene in one of the Gospels, I'm not quite sure which. Jesus called Peter the rock. And for those of you in this class who want to build your house on top of a hill, you know you can't just pour concrete, it doesn't work. You have to bring some people with huge drills. You know, they're gonna dig down until they reach stones, hard rocks. And then they're going to pour some concrete, make some pillars, because your house needs to sit on rocks, not on sand. Peter, of course, is honored by being considered a rock, according to Jesus, this wise man. At a certain point, Jesus looks at him and says, you're going to deny me 3 times. In fact, you are Satan incarnate. And Peter says, no. And lo and behold, Peter denies him. There is a scene. Jesus has been betrayed by all his disciples. He has been crucified. He's dead. He hasn't yet risen. And there is Peter. There is this beautiful imagery in the Gospels. He's in the room all by himself. The sun is shining through this window. And Peter is screaming that he needs help. He has nothing to hang on to. That he thought he was the rock, but he wasn't. So what you need to understand is initially the kid has the shadows to play with. Then the kid has the people behind him to play with, imaginatively. Then he has fire to play with. At every different stage, there are things that occupy him. There comes a point where there is nothing, it's just the darkness of the cave. There is nothing to occupy you on the inside. You want to figure out how to get rid of sadness, to get rid of doubt, bring about certitude, but none of these things are possible. You want to love, you want to feel, you want to do some goddamn thing out there. You want to have some direction, because human beings are like dogs. Without a GPS, you're just chasing after your own tail, and after a while you just die. There is something to which he wants to hang on, but there is nothing. But Plato doesn't talk about depression. Plato doesn't tell us how lonely of a journey it is from the world of shadows, from darkness to light. He just kind of tells us this ridiculous story in 3 paragraphs and he calls it quits. I don't know what it takes for someone to endure and to survive. When you talk about the story of someone like Moses or someone like the Buddha, is that they have an entire culture within them. They have these shadows and they love these shadows. They love their parents, they love their wives and their kids. They love their culture, they love their religion, they love their people. And all of a sudden they say, it's not enough. And the sort of philosophy they kind of come up with after they have completed the journey is that they understand the human struggle. You know, unless you know the dangerousness of the whole thing, that some people, it'll lead them to suicide, mental issues, you know, that lead to lifelong paralysis, advertise this stuff only to those who are suitable. Don't go around preaching that it's good for everyone. You know, and that's one of the nice things about the ancient world. You allow people to live their lives. Those who are thirsty for other things, you interview them. Because it's a thing to be interviewed before you engage in it.